When you're nearing the end of June and the Mets are sitting in fourth place with a bloated $350 million payroll, it does beg the question. Has Steve Cohen's rush to win now come back to blow up in his face? I'll be discussing that and more on today's edition of Locked On Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Today's episode is brought to you by Bird Dogs. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnMLB and they'll throw in a free custom Bird Dogs Yeti-style tumbler with every order. Today's show is something I've had in the holster for a little bit now. It's a thought that crossed my mind, I don't know, about a week and a half ago, where I was just thinking, did the Mets make a mistake? Did Steve Cohen's bluster for coming in and winning right now, was that a problem? Is that why the Mets are seeing some maybe karmic repercussions right now, where they tried to force the issue and it's not working, and you're looking at the next couple of years with the payroll that is bloated by veteran contracts like Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander and Starling Marte, guys who are not performing well right now? Is this a team that's going to be stuck the next couple of years? And is that rush to win something that is now holding this team back all of a sudden, where Steve Cohen wants to win now, and guess what? Because you spent all this money, it's going to take you even longer. That the Mets had taken a little bit more of a wait-and-see approach when Cohen first took over in 2021. And when I started this exercise today, I really didn't know the answer to it. It took me a lot of time sort of dissecting everything that's happened since Steve Cohen has come in to try to figure out where the Mets went wrong. And I'll begin in 2021. I wish we could go back in time further, and Steve Cohen could have bought this team in 2018 after Jacob deGrom wins his first Cy Young, and the Mets could have replayed everything back then. Because really, you're still paying for the sins of the Wilpons for the 2019 and 2020 seasons now. Robinson Cano is still on the books for $20.25 million. And there's far more that stretches beyond that. But this current regime, 2021. So that year, Marcus Stroman comes back on the qualifying offer. You sign Taijuan Walker, you sign Trevor May, you sign James McCann. I don't want to get into the Jonathan Villars and Kevin Pillar's of the world, the smaller moves, but really, for looking at the 2021 offseason in a rush to win, there's one deal you look at. That's the Francisco Lindor trade, followed up by the extension. Now, maybe you could quibble with the fact that the Mets extended him before letting the first year played out, and maybe that deal is a little bit less if they had allowed him to play out the 2021 season. You pay him after that, but there's every chance if you do that, you trade everything you did for nothing because Lindor walks in free agency. I cannot look back in time at that move and the rush to win and complain about it. I'm sure there's a lot of Mets fans that might be firing comments on YouTube about the Lindor trade being a mistake, but here's the way I look at it. Right now, despite not having his best season, Francisco Lindor is a top 25 player when it comes to wins above replacement on Fangraphs. He's top 10 in RBIs as well. He is one of the best defensive shortstops in baseball. Is one of the most durable stars in the league. And he's coming off a near 7-win season. Ahmed Rosario didn't have much trade value then or now. Isaiah Green and Josh Wolf, the two faraway prospects, have not panned out in Cleveland so far. And while Andres Gimenez had one great season, I'd argue he's on a worse contract right now than Francisco Lindor, because he's a guy who's still yet to prove that his 1 year of being an all-star is sustainable. He looks a lot more like the 2021 version of Andres Gimenez than the 2022 version. Is on a contract that's going to pay him $23 million a season for 3 free agent years that never needed to be guaranteed. Now, that's a mistake the Guardians made, potentially, not the Mets. But when I look at the net of what you sent out for Francisco Lindor and the contract he's on, you compare Lindor's contract to Trey Turner's contract, to Xander Bogaerts' contract. to Carlos Correa's contract. Lindor's on, when it comes to mega shortstop deals, a contract that I'd still take over a lot of these guys. And I think over the course of this contract, he's going to continue to prove to be valuable. So that rush to win, is that a mistake the Mets made that you look back on as blowing up in their face? I don't think so. I don't think Lindor is to blame for this season. He's still found a way to be one of the more productive players on this roster. Outside of Brandon Nimmo, he's probably been the most valuable Met. I have to look on that because the Fangraphs wins above replacement because I was only looking at Lindor's numbers. But the point stands. I think that's a good move. Now, you go to the trade deadline of 2021, and that's where you can look at the Mets' rush to win and have your first hang-up. Because at the time, you still, I guess, were in this ambiguous, you don't know what's going to happen with Jacob deGrom. But the Mets were maybe buying into some fool's gold at that deadline. And they folded on kind of a moral standing that they had when they started this window. Because the thing is, the Mets wanted to build on the Dodgers model when they came in with new ownership. You spend big, you take big financial commitments, you rebuild a farm system, and you don't hamstring yourself long-term. You don't sell top-tier prospects to win now. You do it all financially. And they thought they had a chance. So they trade Pete Crow Armstrong for Javi Baez. Massive mistake. PCA right now has an 842 OPS in AA at 21 years old. He's a top prospect in the Cubs system. And if he was still with the Mets, once this wave graduates of Alvarez and Beatty, I'm not sure if they're still considered prospects. At this point, by the end of the season, they won't be. He would be the best prospect in the Mets system. That was a big mistake. It was at service of trying to win, but sometimes you just got to say, I can't make that deal. And that's going to be instructive as you head towards this deadline. Now, you look at what they did last season. You signed Scherzer, Marte, Escobar, Canna, Ottavino, trade for Bassett. The prospects that went out in the Chris Bassett trade have not panned out for Oakland. You won 101 games. Yes, we could quibble with all the moves made at last year's deadline because they weren't great. The Darren Ruff trade looks awful. The Tyler Naquin trade looks awful. The Vogelback trade is one we can debate because Colin Holderman has been not incredible, but a solid, serviceable reliever in Pittsburgh. So maybe you want that one back as well. But you won 101 games and you were trying to win a World Series. And if this Mets team got better pitching in that series against the Padres and win that one, you never know. Maybe that team goes on a run. So I still don't blame anything up to this point on Steve Cohen other than some bad luck. And that's where we're going to get into this season and just overall the philosophy of spending that much. Because history does show that's not necessarily the best mode of operation, but it doesn't mean it's impossible to win this way. That's what I want to get to next. Before we do get into that, though, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Baseball season's in full swing. There's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, which is America's #1 sports book. Because right now, new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to join today, and you can bet on so much. If you want to bet on the Mets, you can do so, and you can create a same-game parlay. So let's just say against the Phillies, you want to bet on Pete Alonso hit a home run, the Mets to win. You could combine those in the same-game parlay and net more if both of those things happen. Maybe you want to bet against the Mets because you don't think they're going to win against the Phillies and their downslides continuing. You can do that. Or even if you want to say, Carlos Carrasco's pitching, I don't trust that the Mets are going to win it early, you can bet on the Phillies' first 5, or you can bet on the Mets' first 5. There's a lot of different ways that you can play at FanDuel. So don't miss your chance to snag a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. The New York Mets play the Philadelphia Phillies at 7:05 Eastern Time. If you want to catch every pitch of the Mets' hometown broadcast, you can do so with Sirius XM on the SXM app. Just search Mets. Now, looking at what led us to this point of the season for the Mets, they've gotten bad pitching. It's that simple. It's that cut and dry. And that is really the one place you can look at. And if you want to say the Mets rushed the window, that's where you're looking. Because It's Justin Verlander, Max Scherzer. That's the big debate when it comes to the Mets rushing. It's signing these guys on these massive contracts at their age. And if you look at the Mets this season, Mike Mayer, which you can find on Twitter, Mike Mayer 22 for Mets Mirais. He is great with Mets information. He tweeted this today. ERA for the Mets, or the 7 Mets with at least 5 stars this year. Kodai Senga 3.53, Max Scherzer 4.04, Joey Lucchesi 4.43, Justin Verlander 4.50, Tyler McGill 5.17, Carlos Carrasco 6.34, David Peterson 8.08. That's why the Mets have been bad this year. It's that simple. It's that cut and dry. It's the starting rotation. But you go back to the spending this offseason. Did the Mets rush into this window? Edwin Diaz, Brandon Nimmo, Jeff McNeil. 2 homegrown Mets, one that has spent most of his career at the Mets that you decided to lock up. The Diaz contract, 5 for 102. Quibble with it if you want to. It's not the Mets' fault he got injured. And if he was on this team, they would be much better. Brandon Nimmo looks like value right now at 8 years, $162 million. Jeff McNeil, even though he's not having a great year, I still look at that contract and think over the course of the 4-year deal with the 5th-year club option, 4 years, $50 million, with the 5th-year option at 15.75, with a $2 million buyout, I think he's going to be value on that deal. I really do. So I got no issue with any of that. And it all leads into a larger window that you extended with those guys. Kodai Senga, 5 years, $75 million with an opt after the 3rd year. Looks like a value contract up to this point. We're not going to knock him for bullpen moves of Ottavino and Raley. Tommy Pham has been incredible value, but a 1-year deal. Omar Narvaez, his money's not changing the world. He likely opts in next year, but considering the payroll that you have, whatever, doesn't really matter. Again, you get back to Scherzer and Verlander. And the Mets gave Max Scherzer that contract when he had over 2,500 innings of mileage on his arm. He's thrown 210 innings in a Mets uniform. Now he's going to turn 39 at the end of July. As much as you want to look back now and say, would it be better if the Mets didn't have that contract on the books? You'd also be erasing the 2nd best regular season in franchise history where the Mets won 101 games. So you can't do that. Justin Verlander had over 3,200 innings, or has over 3,200 innings of mileage on his arm, turned 40 in February, had Tommy John a few years ago. But the Mets needed to add a starter this offseason. Carlos Rodon still hasn't thrown a pitch in a regular season game for the Yankees. Jacob deGrom got Tommy John. Of those 3 options at the top of the market, the Mets probably picked the best of the 3, and we'll see if this can pan out for them. But the issue is if it doesn't, and you get 2 guys over the hill, here's where the problem will lie. Next year the Mets get some relief, right? Cano finally off the books. $3.25 million for Darren Ruff comes off your books, and instead of owing James McCann $11 million like you did this year, next year it goes down to $8 million. If you spend $2.5 million on buyouts for Canna and Escobar on $20.5 million in club options, you free up a lot of money there. Okay. You assume that Scherzer, Ottavino, Narvaez all pick up player options. The bottom line with all of that is most likely the Mets start this offseason with $242 million in payroll. And you look at free agency to fix that rotation, it's Shohei Ohtani or bust. Really. Because it's Marcus Stroman, Daddy's coming back. It's Clayton Kershaw. At this point, don't think he's leaving LA for the Mets. If anything, it'd probably be to go join whatever's going on in Texas. And then there's Eduardo Rodriguez. I don't know how much Mets fans would be excited about that. David Peterson and Tyler McGill currently don't look like long-term viable options in this rotation. That's a massive hit for this franchise. In some ways, it's a bigger deal than what's happening with Verlander and Scherzer, in the sense that they were supposed to represent starter depth for years to come. So your rotation next year is Verlander, Scherzer, Senga, Quintana. And then adding whatever 5th starter. Now, if it's Ohtani, unbelievable. It's an insane amount of money, though. And there's every chance that he stays in Anaheim with the Angels or Los Angeles, goes to the Giants, or pick any other team that's willing to sign him for $50+ million a season. Okay? So you can't count on that. The bottom line is the Mets are going to need Scherzer, Verlander, and Marte to live up to their contracts over this next 2 to 3 year window, or it's going to be very hard to win at a high level. And so that's where you're at. And as much as I would love to just say, the Mets screwed up, because granted, you look at a sport like basketball, the Brooklyn Nets change ownership, spend a ton, blows up in their face. The Phoenix Suns are doing it right now. There's every chance that might blow up in their face. There's been a lot of franchises in sports. The Carolina Panthers sold the team. Guy comes in, spends a ton of money, blows up in his face. So, yeah, that's generally what happens in these situations. It's hard to just throw money at problems and fix everything. The Dodgers did it, and they were able to win in the short term, and they've been able to now extend that to the long term. And the bigger thing for the Mets is to get the long term right. And so when I look at this team at this year's deadline, and where you're at with a month to go here, or month and change, I think the biggest thing to think about is making sure you keep that long-term window paramount. And that doesn't mean you have to trade Mark Canha and Tommy Pham and David Robertson and sell off your 1 years to get prospect. You can. If the Mets are way out of it, I would advise that. But ultimately, it means not trying to put a Band-Aid over a bullet wound on the team this year and trading prospects that could help the future to help this team now. You've been throwing money at problems. What you don't want to do is throw prospect capital at problems. Because if we look at the biggest mistakes the Mets have made since Steve Cohen took over, it's the trade deadlines have been awful. Awful. I look at this offseason, there was no telling that Verlander would go from a 1.75 ERA Cy Young season to a 4.50 ERA. No one would have predicted that. There's no telling that Starling Marte would go from all-star season to falling off a cliff. That Jeff McNeil wouldn't produce the way that he did last year. There's a lot that has gone wrong that you could have anticipated. Edwin Diaz tearing his ACL, celebrating in the WBC. And a freak injury. Now, the Mets have time to make this season worth it. But if it becomes a sunk season, let it be a sunk season. And don't try to rush this window any further at the deadline, because then you really might get to a point where you've hurt yourself. Because, again, the last two deadlines, and I don't even want to get into the Tyler Naquin trade. Look up the prospects that got dealt there. Maybe I'll talk about it at some point. But a lot went wrong at last year's deadline. A lot went wrong. The 2021 deadline be giving up PCA. So that's what I'd be concerned with moving forward. Now, luckily, over the last couple seasons in the Steve Cohen era, the Mets have owned the Phillies. So, or at least 2022 and 2023, I should say. Maybe that can continue. I will talk about this Mets-Phillies series in just a minute. We'll do a series preview. But first, another word from our sponsors. The New York Mets play the Philadelphia Phillies at 7:05 Eastern Time tonight. Catch every pitch. The Mets' hometown broadcast with SiriusXM on the SXM app. Just search Mets. Now, last time the Mets faced the Phillies, it was at the end of May leading into the 1st of June, and the Mets swept that series. At the time, the Mets were 30-27. They were 3.5 games back of the Braves in the division, and they were the first wild card team at the time. It's crazy, right? Look up now. What's happened since? Well, the Mets sit, let's count, wild card teams. You got the Giants, you got the Marlins, you got the Dodgers, you got the Brewers, you got the Phillies, you got the Cubs, you got the Padres, you got the Pirates. All the way down, you find the Mets with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 teams that have to leap over to get back into the wild card. 7 games out there. And do you even want to look at the division right now? New York Mets compared to the Braves, they're 14 out. So almost at this point can kiss the division goodbye. Now, the Phillies, they're 10 games out of the division. Okay. Didn't expect them to actually take that over in short order, but they've made up massive, massive ground in the wild card chase. They're 3 games out right now. What's happened? Well, the Mets, since that series, well, they've gone 4-13. And you look at the Phillies, they've gone 13-4. So nearly the inverse of each other, or exactly the inverse of each other. Jeez. You look at the Phillies and the schedule they've had. Now, granted, they were the beneficiaries of an easier schedule. Okay. They went into Washington, they took care of business, won a series. They went into Detroit, really took care of business, got a sweep. Then the Dodgers came to Philly. Actually, that series against the Tigers was also in Philly. Regardless, though, the Dodgers come to town as well. Phillies take that series, win 2 of 3. They then go into Arizona and win 3 of 4 against a really good Diamondbacks team. Go out to Oakland and sweep a series. And now the Braves travel to Philly and took both of what turned into a 2-game set with a rainout. So they've been pretty hot. And granted, they did lose to the Braves and they did beat up some bad teams in Oakland and Detroit and the Nationals, but they also beat some good teams in the Dodgers and the Diamondbacks. So they're playing good baseball. And you look at the lineup for them and some guys that are maybe performing better than the last time we saw them. Kyle Schwarber's hit 4 home runs since that series. He's looking at an OPS of 883 since then. JT Realmuto's hitting 275, 356 on base, 650 slug. He has 3 home runs, 2 triples, 2 doubles. He's at an OPS over 1,000 since then. Bryson Stott's hitting 340 since then, 943 OPS. Castellanos doing about the same. And you still look at Trey Turner struggling, and Bryce Harper hasn't had power in this stretch, but he is hitting 298, 382 on base. Just hasn't left the yard over the last 15 days, which isn't a good sign for the Mets because he's obviously due. The Mets, can they finally break this funk? Was this just a between Philly series, or whatever you want to say there, between one Philly series to the next, where the Mets were going to be terrible and they're going to get right facing the Phillies on the road? I don't know. You're facing Taijuan Walker as the first game of this series, going up against Kodai Senga. Was that the exact pitching matchup we got last time around when Taijuan faced the Mets? That was on June 1st. Mets knocked him out after just 4 innings pitched, 3 earned runs allowed. Looking it up right now to see if it was Senga, but regardless, you like the Mets matchup in that one. Senga, although has not pitched as well on the road as he has at home. It was actually Scherzer versus Walker in that one, but yeah, it's a matchup where I still like Senga in this one. And I like the Mets' ability to hit Taijuan Walker, although looks like he has been pitching better as of late. Look at his last 3 starts since that one against the Mets in this run where the Phillies have been good. 7 innings pitched against the Tigers, 2 hits, 3 walks, 8 strikeouts, no runs. 5 against the Dodgers, 2 hits, no runs, 2 walks, 5 strikeouts, 5 innings. Oakland, 8 innings, 7 hits, 1 run, 1 hit by pitch, 8 strikeouts. So he has a 1.50 ERA in the month of June, including that start against the Mets, where he gave up 3 over 4 innings. So maybe it's a hot Taijuan that's going to carve the Mets, and that would be extremely frustrating. Now you look at the second game of this series, Carlos Carrasco versus Christopher Sanchez. And I'll tell you, I hate this matchup. Not because of Carlos Carrasco, although that doesn't help. 6.34 ERA in the season, going into a ballpark where a fly ball could really hurt him. It's Christopher Sanchez for me. He was a top 30 prospect in a bad Phillies system. He was ranked at 17 by MLB.com, but that's not why I'm concerned. I'm concerned because he's a no-name 26-year-old left-handed pitcher, and this is the New York Mets we're talking about. That's why it concerns me. Now, imagine you will have the righty lineup out there, which suddenly means Mark Canha, Tommy Pham, both in the lineup. I'm sure Vogie's going to get the start against Taijuan the day before. We'll see who gets to start against him, if it's Canha or Pham. And yeah, we'll see. Maybe the Mets go Escobar against Christopher Sanchez. Don't know if that's a good decision or a bad decision, considering Brett Beatty's somewhat reverse splits this year, but it is what it is. We'll see if the Mets pull that one out. And hopefully the ideal scenario is you win one of the two and you get a rubber match on Sunday and Max Scherzer shows up the way he did in that Astros series. And he's going up against Zach Wheeler, who has settled down and is great again. 3.48 ERA in the season, 98 strikeouts. That's going to be a great pitcher's duel. Hopefully the Mets maybe shock us and win the series before them. But if they get in a rubber match, hopefully Scherzer lives up to the contract and goes up and beats a former Met, and you finally get back on track. And that's the thing, right? You look at the Mets schedule coming up ahead of the All-Star break. I'm not going to rehash all of it, but you got this series, okay? You go back home. You got the Brewers. You got the Giants. Two good teams, but not necessarily great teams. So the Giants are on a 10-game winning streak currently. But you can take the next 3 series, which I know is asking a ton. Then you head out for a West Coast trip before the All-Star break of Arizona and San Diego, and you hold your own out there. Maybe the Mets will be at a place at the All-Star break where we're not feeling horrible about their prospects of making a push in the second half. But it's got to start one series at a time. It's got to start this weekend against the Philadelphia Phillies, a team that you owned last year, 14-5 record, and you swept in your first series this year. Can you keep that dominance rolling at a time where you are clearly on a big dip down and the Phillies this month have been on a huge upswing? You would think the Phillies are due to lose and the Mets might be due to win, but who knows what will unfold. That's going to be all, though, for today's edition of Locked On Mets. I'm begging to have something exciting to talk about on a Saturday morning bonus edition of Locked On Mets. So we're going to put it out there now. Mets win, we'll do a podcast. Make sure for all you everydayers you're following, you rate, you review, and you're subscribed on YouTube so you don't miss any of the content. Follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show, Locked On Mets. If you want to catch every pitch of the Mets hometown broadcast against the Phillies this weekend, you do so with SiriusXM on the SXM app. Just search Mets.